Another day, another copium theory. Okay, but just hear me out on this one. It might sound a bit out there, but I have some honest-to-heck evidence that I think you'll find pretty compelling along with some context. Before we begin though, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, since it really helps me out in the channel. My next milestone is 5K, which we're still pretty far from, but I know we can make it. Okay, now let's talk about it. Splatoon 3's bad map design, blah blah blah. It looked better in the trailers, what happened, blah blah blah. You know the whole song and dance. If you need me to explain to you the whole map design situation we've been talking about for the past year, then you've been living under a really heavy rock, and please, if you need help, tell me and I'll call a search team and paramedics for you. Here's the kicker though. What if I told you that I believe the simplified basic launch maps have been for the most part intentional, in order to give us the intended versions at a later date? That the Splatoon 3 devs have purposely released the game with canonically incomplete versions of them, with the illusion of being fixed later down the line. Yeah, okay, with any other developer or game series, this sounds absolutely and laughably insane to even entertain the idea of, but think about it. Think about who is making this game. This particular development team over many years has made it abundantly clear that they will purposely hold back any and all kinds of content if it means it can slowly be drip-fed back over the course of the game's lifespan. Animal Crossing New Horizons was infamously lacking in this regard, with way too many features lacking at launch to count, but look at how updates in the Splatoon games have always panned out. Content easily accessed in earlier games would take months, even over a year to make it back, when it obviously doesn't take that long to develop, such as weapon kits is an easy example. They hold back tons and tons of stuff to give later in order to keep a consistent flow of updates that keeps the game alive. Or at least they try. Now, I'm not saying this is necessarily a bad thing, at least in moderation. I'm just stating the facts of how these devs operate. It's also key to note how the universe of Splatoon is meant to be treated like a real, breathing world that grows and changes through time alongside its audience. The devs themselves have even gone on record stating this as their goal. So when you put 2 and 2 together, along with how the maps in the past have already shown to have changed between games, such as Hammerhead Bridge having its construction completed, how could you not entertain the idea? It only makes sense from that perspective that they'd be willing to hold back the real versions of the maps at launch while making them under construction, with the goal of being renovated to their intended layouts in the future. Well,
thank the maker.
That means that every bad change to every map must get fixed at some point, right? Well, not really. To be clear, I'm not claiming that the devs are purposely making the maps bad per se, just incomplete if that makes sense. As I believe there's a stark difference between the two, even if being incomplete still indirectly makes them bad by nature. I don't think the intent was to make absolutely abhorrent maps to make good later on, like, just kidding, we're absolutely amazing at making good maps. Instead, I'm at the stance that the map designers still have the stubborn mentality of limiting movement options, just not nearly as bad as the launch stages would make us believe. Like, I don't think this block missing a manta is gonna be fixed from theoretical construction. That's just a change they genuinely believed was good for the map. The Mahi rework is also a good example of this. Yeah, this is still a more limited and simplified version of the original stage with a few key routes missing, but oh my god, it's actually playable and in most modes really fun now, unlike before where it was one of the most cramped and claustrophobic maps in the game. You see what I'm kind of getting at here? Like, I don't think the devs were fully aware of just how bad they were making the stages when putting them under construction, since they still clearly believe in somewhat streamlined layouts, just again not nearly as bad as the launch maps make it seem. Okay, so we've talked about the evidence to why they would do this, but what about the in-game proof? Where's the actual construction spoken of? Well, I have a little list I'd like to go over briefly. So let's look at a few examples. Eeltail Alley is usually my go-to. There's these giant symmetrical tarp scaffoldings on both sides of the map that even weirdly extends far outside the boundaries in a very specific shape. Like, yeah, it could be a visual thing, but it seems odd, doesn't it? It's also good to note these tarpings are just awkwardly placed in general, completely cutting off this rooftop over here. I do believe this stage should be on the weaker side of examples though, just due to the fact that the construction could just be explained as being part of the map's theming of Splatsville being a new town. Not to mention that in their Turn of the Millions trailer, on the beta of what's meant to be the completed version of the map, we can still see this construction, though of course this is in fact the beta version for a reason, but at the same time, the idea of an unfinished town just supports the theory even further in my opinion. But I'd still say it's a weaker example because of that. On the contrary, Brinewater Springs is a much better example, because look at these giant structures of scaffolding. Just like in Eeltail, they're completely symmetrical while extending way further out from the stage than necessary, and while it isn't impossible for construction to be a theme they want for a resort spa temple like this, it's certainly very odd to include these just for the heck of it without any meaning while they cover the stage's other much more interesting visuals. I could just imagine the possibilities of an extension being planned behind these. Like, man, this one in particular really excites my imagination because, oh my god, Brinewater turning good and not 15 feet in diameter hammer would be the coolest comeback story of all time. Undertow is a bit more discreet, but you'll notice these completely out of place scaffoldings blocking off what was clearly meant to be a flank at some point. I find this extremely interesting since unlike other maps, you can't really argue that construction is just a visual theme because of how random out of place these things are. The entire area over here in general to me just looks like there was meant to be a lot more ground that was replaced with these giant, slightly suspicious metal blocks and barriers that all only appear in this area. Speaking of giant, ugly pieces of metal, let's look at Flounder. As you know, the entire right side of the stage was basically completely removed in this game, but what I find interesting about it are all these slabs of metal that were added exclusively to these places to patch up the removed terrain. You see it on this entire side of the building that used to be inkable, but also where the exit of the alleyway flank used to be. It's also worth noting that this is the only area where these fences appear, which doesn't really mean much, but why didn't they just wall it off like the rest of the stage? This entire area just feels clunky and out of place, and I want to believe it's purposeful, because if I were a dev who wanted to permanently remove an entire chunk of terrain, I'd want to patch it up gracefully instead of making it stick out as much as this does. There's a lot, and I mean a lot more examples like this all throughout the game, both big and small. However, I think the absolute most interesting case, which at least to me solidifies this theory, is this footage of Umami Ruins featured in the original Splatoon 3 Direct. The map as it is today is of course an archaeological site under heavy construction, featuring cranes, scaffolding with workers, tarpings, and grates supported by metal beams. The center structure also has a wooden plank taped to the sides of it, along with being completely encased by glass. You can probably guess by this that not a single one of these details were present in this older version we saw. And on top of that, this iteration of Umami in fact had a lot more terrain, almost like the construction was completed here. Look at the buildings off to the side, this actual left side high ground, these cool wooden platforms. Even the right side has actual high ground to contest attackers with a lot more interesting curved terrain instead of this awful grate that does nothing. I just find this to be the most convincing proof of this theory, because why on earth, in what dimension, circle of hell, would they remove all this terrain while also simultaneously making sure to add as much construction to the stage as possible and have this much better version be so finalized that it was shown off in its full glory in the direct, if this was truly meant to be the final version of the map? Unless the developers truly hate fun and creativity, which they don't by the way, the only explanation I can think of is that they purposely dumbed down the stage, putting it under construction in-universe to be renovated to its intended finished version later down the line. I simply can't see it any other way. Look, I know dev teams can be weird, but I find it really hard to believe an entire team filled with such creative and talented individuals with a clear artistic vision can collectively agree and decide that these doled down, uninspired layouts are better than the gold we know they've had before. As of right now, I am a firm believer in the construction theory, and only time will tell if it actually turns out to be true. And look, even if it isn't true, we can at least sleep peacefully knowing that map reworks are in fact happening, and if Mahi's quality is anything to go off of, they will be very good. Keep coping with me, friends. But also, you know, don't get your hopes up too high. Don't entirely depend on this theory being factual. Have some discretion, because even though there's a ton of evidence, it's just a theory.